Good evening, this is Woodblock Printmaker Dave Bull here in our shop in Asakusa, Tokyo to introduce our next video. I'm not at my carving bench tonight because, as you have just seen in that cold open, the action will not be taking place here on the first floor of the Mokuhankan building, but right upstairs on the third floor in one of the printer's rooms. And the content? This will be one of our step-by-step process videos, the ones where we show the colors building up bit by bit as a beautiful woodblock print gradually comes alive. It's not a typical ukiyo-e print that you will see us make this time. It's something a bit different. It's an example of woodblock printmaking, not as an artistic end in itself, but printmaking in the service of transmitting information, showing us what something actually looks like. Back in the old days here in Japan, before the advent of easy color photography and press printing, a publisher or a book producer who wanted to show people what an object actually looked like didn't have too many options. The traditional ukiyo-e genre was of course capable of depicting such a thing as a teacup. Here's one typical example, but as you can see, it's really stylized, just like her face, of course, and doesn't give much of a flavor of the real object. Now, it turns out that this isn't an inherent limitation in the woodblock technique, but is simply a question of allocation of resources. If the publisher and or designer are willing to take the time and trouble and make the investment, the woodblock medium can indeed be quite realistic. And it's that kind of print we are going to look at tonight. Back in 2003, when I was making my Surimono albums, I selected this design for inclusion in album number 5. I took it from a woodblock printed book showing objects in a museum collection, and is a depiction of a tea bowl dating, I believe, back from the Tokugawa era. I think they did a wonderful job of showing us exactly what this bowl looks like. And even though this is just a flat sheet of paper, I can very much feel the shape and the texture of the object. As I mentioned though, the production of a print like this requires a lot more resources than the simpler ukiyo-e type of design. More blocks and more impressions. And it's much more complicated to build it and figure it out. The challenge for me, who had no access to the original blocks that this was made from, was to study the print carefully and figure out how to reverse engineer a woodblock set that would create the same image. I thought it came up pretty well, and the blocks I carved all the way back then are now being used by the Mokuhankan team to produce prints for our shop. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, you will get to see how this works. You will watch as our young printer Rei-chan builds the image step by step from a blank sheet of paper up to the finished bowl. Now, during the couple of weeks that she worked on this project, each time she started a new color impression, our staff member Cameron took his video camera up there to record it. Now, he and I, we've been doing this a long time, and we know that our printers sometimes find this really bothersome. We're all sort of, please hold right there, wait while I focus, or can you move your arm out of the way, and things like this. But he and Rei-chan took the time and trouble to try and bring you a production that would give a real sense of how this print is made. And one that we hope is also useful to people out there making their own efforts to create woodblock prints. I'm quite sure that some of the things you're about to see might need a bit of explanation, so I'll get my microphone ready and we'll offer comments here and there as it all comes to life. Let's get started.
So here's the basic mix that you're going to see repeated time and again during this video. The block surface itself has been moistened, and then on top of it will be rubbed a blend of two things: the pigment mix, which she dabbed into the hairs of her brush in this case, and some starch paste, which she tapped onto the block. Her goal is to then get these thoroughly mixed together and spread out across the surface as evenly as possible. The action is always vigorous, but with a very light touch. She makes her final strokes in a direction perpendicular to the wood grain. This helps minimize the amount of grain that shows in the impression. And here you can see just how this is going to work. Each and every block has a notch, a small corner carved into it. The paper nestles gently into this mark, which together with another mark over on the left provide perfect registration. What, all over again? Yes, when I chatted with Rei-chan about this later, I learned that she had felt, after seeing them all done, that the tone had been a bit lighter than required, so she simply ran the same color all over again. It is sometimes very difficult during the early stages to visualize what something will look like after other colors are in place, and this is all part of developing experience. Okay, now let's get going with the bowl itself. This will start, as do most traditional Japanese woodblock prints, with the printing of the key block, the one that contains the outlines of the design. The mix is the same as before, a dab of faint pigment and a dab of starch paste. Her head is almost blocking it here, but you can see the corner mark and just how carefully she nestles the sheet of paper into it. People who visit our workshops and see this for the first time are all surprised by the same thing, just how small an amount of pigment is required for these impressions. For many of these, the amount of paste is far larger than that of the pigment. Something else that's fairly clear in this shot is the amount of clearance that has been carved around the area to be printed. You can see the bowl shape here, surrounded by a cleared area out to a distance of yubi sanbon, the width of 3 fingers side by side. That's the carver's general guideline. If the clearance were not enough, then pigment on the outer areas could of course stain the print. This might be a bit unclear. At first glance it looks like another doubled impression, as we saw with the background. But no, this is a different piece of wood. This will give a tone to the outside surface of the bowl, and will omit the inner area. You'll see in a minute. I'm not quite sure why she is using a backing sheet so extensively on this job. We used this if the printing paper is perhaps a bit too moist and in danger of abrading, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. Another cause could be if the skin of her baron is beginning to wear, and perhaps that's the case this time. Here's our first gradation, and for this we are going to use exactly the same block as the previous step. Rei-chan begins this by moistening the wood surface with a damp cloth wrapped around a piece of wood to keep it stable. Then a dab of pigment at the bottom of the bowl, and a dab of paste at the other end of the brush. The brush movement blends the two parts together. She has total control of how far up the bowl to bring the pigment. And the same block yet again being used now for the third time. This one will be what is known as an atenashi gradation, a gradation with no fixed area. It's all freehand, a bit like painting the surface of the block. Oops, what's this? Isn't she going to show it to us? No, not yet. In order to make this gradation as blurred and vague as possible, she is doing it twice, making no special attempt to be in exactly the same location each time. The two versions will blur over each other, ensuring that the result will not have a clearly defined shape. And here we see the result, an almost imperceptible blurry tone in the upper portion of the bowl. When I was carving this block set, I of course tried to maximize use of the pieces of wood that I had on hand. As you can see, for this small area, I flipped that previous block around to be able to utilize a free area of wood. So it ended up with two sets of registration marks on this single face. A narrow gradation like this is very difficult. If she were to let her brush wander just a bit too much offline, there would be no gradation. Simply the pigment would cover the entire carved area. Nice job, but you can perhaps guess where we are going next. Yes, she is going to repeat this one. Doing these long, narrow gradations in two passes is not unusual. It is very difficult to get a deep, rich tone at one side and a very light feathery edge at the other. So she kept things lighter and broader the first time, but will now tighten up and make the second pass as narrow as possible. And now for something a bit different. In every one of the impressions that you have seen so far, the pigment material that Rei-chan has rubbed over the block has been a transparent medium, simple powder pigments mixed with paste. But this one is different. A blue pigment has been mixed with gohun, which is an opaque white powder obtained from ground seashells. Basically calcium carbonate, I guess. Use of this type of pigment was very common in Kyoto and Osaka workshops when making reproductions of paintings in woodblock form, but it was almost never used in the traditional ukiyo-e type printmaking practiced in Edo, Tokyo, where transparent, flat coloring was the norm. It's not going to be apparent to the viewer here, but she has switched to a different Darken, the rubbing pad, to make this next impression. As you will see, rather than a wide flat color, this one is a group of very small carved spots, so her rubbing tool has to be very delicate in order not to damage the paper. Rei-chan, along with all of our printers, has a good collection of barons of different strengths, and will select the most appropriate one from her toolbox for each particular woodblock. Impressions like these past few, made up of quite small areas, are done quite quickly as opposed to the earlier wide impressions, which needed considerable rubbing. But no matter how quickly the brushing out of the color or the taking of the impression, one part that is still done slowly and methodically each and every time is the placing of the paper into the registration marks. It must be absolutely perfect. Here's another opaque impression, this one using the gohun powder by itself without any blue tint. Another thing to mention about these opaque impressions is that the rubbing pressure is quite light. We want this pigment to be sitting up on the surface of the paper rather than being driven down deep into the fibers, as with one of the normal impressions done with the transparent pigments. And it also helps if the paper is a tad on the dry side. Too wet or soggy, and this won't work at all. Here's a wider view of Rei-chan's work area. In previous videos, you've seen the sunny printer's room with 4 workstations. That space is now full, so we have built a couple more stations in the neighboring room, among all the shelving units full of woodblocks and other materials. Rei-chan has a snug little space here with enough room for everything she needs. This impression is another small one, just a couple of patchy areas at the base of the bowl to add texture and dimensionality to the image. This is another two-faced block, and actually the area over at the left was experimental and is not being used for this print run. The actual impression she's taking here is a group of fine lines carved over at the other side of the block. These lines might be somewhat difficult to see in these very flat scans, so I think Cameron is going to insert an actual photo at this point so we can see. Yes, here it is. Look at the difference. These woodblock prints are so rich in texture. It looks edible. But we are not finished yet. Rei-chan is going to bring the bowl more to the foreground by putting in a richer tone in the background. You can clearly see how the shape of the bowl has been cut away, leaving just the surrounding area. The metal tool you see Rei-chan using here is simply to keep pigment away from the registration marks, to avoid soiling the paper in those places. And there we have it. Our bowl is complete. Let's see the build-up once more, start to finish, and we'll have that photograph again at the end. So there you have it. As you saw, every individual step is extremely simple and straightforward. But when you put them all together, we end up with such a beautiful, beautiful result. That simplicity is the major reason for the attractiveness of Japanese prints. Their beauty comes from a mixture of three fundamental things. First is the materials. It doesn't get
any simpler. Flat sheet of white paper made with nothing but mulberry bark, mulberry fibers all pressed together. The pigments, just simple powdered pigments mixed with water. The tools themselves, you saw a little dauber to put the color on the block, like a shoe brush to spread it around, and our flat rubbing tool. That's actually fairly sophisticated, but still, it's simple at heart. Press the paper. It's the third part of the recipe where the magic happens. The skill and experience of the craftsman. Craftswoman, in this case, of course, Rei-chan did this. That's the thing that ties it all together. Those years of experience, pulling these simple things together into the finished whole. It's perhaps one of the world's most low-tech processes. It can't be more raw than this, but at the same time, it's one of the most high-touch. Every touch and every feel comes out into the finished print. I hope you enjoyed our performance this evening, Rei-chan's performance this evening. We look forward to bringing the next video really quite soon. Thanks for watching, and good night for now.